actually a picture of the Battle of Solferino 150 years ago. And the Battle of Solferino marked the birth of what has now become the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement around the world. So, including clearly the ICRC and the New Zealand Red Cross, both of us present here. It's a significant event for us. We're doing a number of things around the world, including in New Zealand, to mark it this year. But interestingly enough, the Battle of Solferino, where Henri Dunant, this Geneva businessman, basically took humanitarian action spontaneously to help the wounded and the sick on the battlefield, also more or less coincided with the first inventional commercial utilization of photography as a means of mass communication. It more or less coincided with the increasing use of the telegraph as a way of communicating between different continents, of opening up new channels of communication which hadn't existed. And I think it's the timing here is quite significant. If we look at our archives at the ICRC in Geneva, the first photograph we find is actually of the American Civil War. And a few years later, more or less at the same time, we have the story of Florence Nightingale, who apparently was more or less found the incentive and the motivation to act the way she did because of newspaper reports about the Crimean Wars at the time. Final point I want to make is that already right at that beginning, the humanitarians themselves were also trying to use this potential of means of mass communication to get their message across. So Henri Dunant, the founder of the Red Cross, actually after this battle went back home to Geneva, wrote a book in which he elaborated his two main ideas, which were on the one hand starting up the Red Cross, on the other hand codifying treaties of international law initially to protect the wounded and sick on the battlefield. And what did he do with this book? Well, he published it at his own expense and then distributed it especially to European royal houses to get the message across, fundamentally, to make sure that people paid attention. So he too immediately seized the means of communications technology and dissemination that were available at that stage. So how does all this present itself from our perspective? Why do we, as aid organizations, need the media? I think the first reason is pretty clear. It has a lot to do with fundraising, especially in this day and age, where the economic crisis clearly is not just affecting the media, but it's also affecting our sector in a major way. We are still trying to analyze this, but I think it would be fair to say that globally, for organizations that mainly rely on private or corporate funding, they probably have to be looking at a 25% decrease this year, quite easily, in terms of what they will be able to raise. Clearly, media presence has a significant influence on this. But I think it's not just about funding, it's actually also about something we like to call positioning. It's also about the fact that to be seen to be relevant, to be seen to be doing something, it's no longer enough to be great in the field, even though that's still the bedrock of everything. But you also have to be seen to be doing something, and that happens through the media. Now, the second reason why we are interested in media coverage of war and of the humanitarian consequences of war is that obviously we want to raise public awareness of the suffering that is caused here, of what's actually going on. But linked to that, there is also the fact that conflicts are becoming probably more and more destructured, difficult to read, chaotic, anarchic. That, where you have the okay to go to a certain area from the commander at the top or the rebel warlord at the top, it used to mean that you could rely on that and that the guys at the checkpoint would be aware of that and willing to accept that. But the fact is that that's no longer the case. Getting the security guarantees needed to have access to the field, to have access to victims on all sides of the front lines is still possible, but it probably now takes even more effort than it always used to. That brings me on to another shared challenge, which is the fact that we have to ask ourselves whether and to what extent we really are actually a welcome presence in conflict areas these days. Clearly, for the ICRC and for aid organizations, this is crucial, because if our presence is not accepted, if what we are trying to do is not accepted, and how we're trying to do it as a neutral and independent organization is not accepted, then we do not usually have the basis which allows us to actually go out there into these dangerous places and do our job. Most of us continue to work without armed protection and certainly without armed enforcement. We cannot use the power of arms to establish our presence and to establish our activities. It needs to be accepted. But what we're seeing actually is that, and again, this is not new, and again, I think it also relates to the media to a certain extent, that our motives are increasingly being questioned. Are we somehow, as an organization, the ICRC, seen largely as Western, agents of Western neocolonialism? Do we support what is very often seen as Western double standards, meaning that organizations and the media are hugely interested in what are suspected to be war crimes in Sudan, but a lot less willing to let others look into the reality of suspected war crimes allegations in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Gaza? So I think this is an environment, and I'm not saying that they're right, but this is an environment and a change in the environment which really we have to deal with and we have to overcome. Local media, again, are a key factor in this. I think if we can convince local media that really we are what we say, we work how we say we do, then we have a major ally on the ground to overcome this lack of acceptance. I think it's also linked to this that there's an environment which, again, this is not new, but it's becoming increasingly difficult for the media too. I think Sri Lanka is a very good recent example of the extent to which pretty much conflict actors all over the world now want to manage the spin. They want to manage what is known or not known about the reality in conflict areas. And one of the ways they do that is to keep the media, and especially to keep the Western media, out, and instead try to project their own message. If you look at the Sri Lankan example, very interesting, both sides, both the government and the Tamil Tigers, massively involved in shooting, providing and disseminating pictures, television footage, statements, etc., about an area that was over weeks never directly accessible to journalists. Now, if, as an aid organization, you are seen to be countering that propaganda, that spin, you might very quickly run into problems. Because again, people then may no longer be able and willing to accept your presence on the ground and to let you get on with your main job, which is actually to help people in these areas exactly that have been cut off from the world's media. Well, how do we actually show the people, the people who are at the heart of this? Again, Chris mentioned this. We do have, and for aid organizations even more, we clearly have an enormous obligation towards them, also when we're communicating publicly, not just when we are trying to help them on the ground. And I think still there, both the media and aid workers tend to fall into the same old pattern of presenting these people as sort of passive recipients of outside support and aid. And nothing could be further from the truth. We'll be publishing some research later this year based on consultations of people suffering because of war in aid countries. And one of the things they are clearly telling us is that the most aid and the most important support comes from within their own community, comes from within their own families, and that this is considerably more important than anything us as outsiders can bring to them. I think it's important to bear that in mind. In Pakistan, the current displacement crisis, the overwhelming majority of the people who've had to flee their homes are actually staying with friends, neighbors, or other communities who simply are willing to share the little they have to put up these people. They haven't gone to camps, which are managed by outside organizations. Next thing, when it comes to how we talk about the situations, I think both of us are still very much caught up and very likely to rely on very, very simplistic tales of good and evil. I think a lot of aid agency communication, but also media coverage of conflict, tends to still be dominated by stories of innocent civilians and evil warlords. And I can see where that comes from. I'm just saying that we have to be extremely careful because we have plenty of examples where this kind of approach really led us up the garden path. I think if we look at both Rwanda, 1994 genocide, and at the Balkans, I think there was a tendency to portray all this as a sort of spontaneous outburst of tribal and ethnic hatred, whereas actually what we were looking at quite clearly was organized and planned campaigns of genocide and mass extermination. And I think to have reported that right from the start in the correct way could have potentially made a huge difference. In terms of how we work together to do all this as aid workers and journalists, I'm pretty optimistic. I think there's a lot of, Chris's Ethiopia example is interesting. I think there's a lot of good day-to-day cooperation going on. But I think, just a little word of warning for journalists, I think it's very tempting maybe to rely on aid workers as being part of the sort of next generation of news gatherers. Fine. You know, we produce a lot of pictures which we put at the disposal of TV stations. We want to do this. We do it because we know that even those journalists who are interested in covering don't have the means to do so. But you know, just bear in mind that our objectives are not the same as yours necessarily. I think it's bear that in mind, and please, you know, again, be transparent about where these pictures and where this information comes from. We do have our own agenda, and I'm certainly not going to make any apologies for that, because I believe in that agenda, but it is an agenda. I know